Welcome back to Dist Media, a startup story. My name is Ben Olmos, founder and CEO of Dist Media. This is a podcast where I take you along my journey of starting Dist Media from the ground up. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. I'm happy you found us, and hopefully you'll like what you hear. For those of you coming back, I'm glad that we piqued your interest enough for you to return, and I hope that you enjoy this next step in our journey. This show is all about documenting Dist Media's startup journey and keeping you in the loop every step of the way. I'll be keeping you up to date on meetings, phone calls, emails, and all the things that I need to do to get this business up and running. So with that, let's pick up where we left off last time. Welcome back, everybody, to Dist Media, a startup story. I am your host, Ben Olmos, and joining me once again, Alan Landry. Alan, how are you?
Ben, I'm doing fantastic as always. Excited to be here and anxious to hear the updates because you're moving like the speed of light, and I'm curious to see how all that's happening because some of that's rolling off into my virtual world.
Yeah, well, it's been good. We've had a lot of good conversations with folks lately, and excited that we're starting to kind of add some new perspectives to not only Dist Media, but also the Daily Pitch. And we're going to be getting some help along those lines. So first off, content and contributors. One of the things that we always wanted to get into with this podcast and this medium is showcasing, highlighting the people that work with us, and also those people whom we seek out to try and gain some wisdom from. And I had mentioned this a couple episodes back that I was on TikTok. I had seen some really interesting videos from a gentleman by the name of John Pabon. And I hope, John, I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And the content he talks about is around greenwashing. And greenwashing is when a company, organization presents itself as being eco-friendly and they are doing things in the spirit of the environment. And as you examine them a little bit more and you take a look at some of their supply chain practices or their operations practices, they're not necessarily living up to the standard that they're trying to present themselves as living up to. And so John has put together a really good book. We actually just had an article released as of the taping of this podcast. And it's a really good interview with John about his perspectives on greenwashing, about what that means, and his book. And in my back and forth with John, he's actually in Australia. I believe he said it was in Melbourne. He's agreed to come onto the show. So we're going to have the opportunity to talk with John in a future episode, and really excited about that. He's a really, really great guy. He has a TikTok channel that I mentioned. I originally kind of came across his content. And what caught my attention was the story of Steve Donziger, who is a Harvard University lawyer. And this is a saga that's been going on for 30 years now. Early in his career, Stephen had tried a case down in South America where Texaco was dumping a bunch of oil and doing so in more of a poor, impoverished part of the Ecuadorian rainforest. And there was a trial. Ultimately, there was a settlement that was created, a little over $9 billion. But the oil company fought back. And the oil company changed hands. Texaco got sold to Chevron. Chevron just brought in the big guns, really started fighting this case. And, it's a really crazy story. What ended up happening to Donziger was he got disbarred. He ends up spending some time in prison. He's on house arrest for over 800 days. Really, really kind of incredible saga. And to this day, Donziger is still very committed to the fact that he feels he was doing the right thing in standing up for the people in South America, in fighting the fight against Chevron and the oil companies down there. And it certainly kind of is one of those examples of companies doing things sometimes that can be questionable. And admittedly, hard for me to come in and be judgmental because I don't know all the facts. And one of the things I always leave myself open to is understanding the full story. I don't understand the full story enough to make a lot of firm claims or stances on things. But I will say, just in what I've heard and what I've read, I can't say that I'm too proud of the way that these companies went to battle and did what they did. And so it's a really interesting thing. But John has stories like this as well as others in his book. And I'm looking forward to having him on to kind of talk about these things because, Alan, one of the things I think that we always think about in organizations I've worked in, I'm sure you've been exposed to this as well. You try to be a good corporate citizen. We talk a lot about that on this podcast, a lot about that on the Daily Pitch, not just paying attention to people's well-being and flourishing, but you try and be a good corporate citizen in the places you do business, and you try and act responsibly. And it's always a shame when you hear that companies made decisions in a different direction than that. But it's hard. It's one of those things that's difficult to hear and to process.
Well, there's so much embedded in that. So I read the interview, which is outstanding, by the way. And this whole business of greenwashing was something I had not heard the term before. So just your exposure to him and doing that interview led me to do some research. And I got to tell you, the more research you do, the madder it makes you about stuff. And embedded in your story there, this whole thing about no good deed goes unpunished. And so you have this Harvard-educated lawyer who fights the good fight and wins the good fight, and then he ends up David against the Goliath monopolies out there. And I think when we see things like that, whether it's mislabeling or food ingredients, or companies that claim to be green and they're not, you kind of get pissed when you feel like somebody's trying to pull the wool over your eye and treat you like you're not an educated person. So I think this is going to be an outstanding little podcast that we're going to do with him and probably lead to a whole lot of other exposure. So
I've mentioned this before. Anybody who's listened to past episodes know this is not really a platform that I'm trying to turn into a political lightning rod, but there are some topics that are just what they are. And I always try to approach things in a open-minded, balanced, let's collect all the facts before we make any, harsh judgments, before we, point fingers and accuse people. And that's just not typically the way that I like to operate anyway. I like to kind of understand things. But I think, to your point, Alan, I think what infuriates me, what really gets me riled up is when there is wrongdoing and what we are getting is spin. And we are getting people deflecting and just not owning up to it and, creating these kind of approaches to, you got to understand this, that, and the other. But I'm sorry. I mean, we're talking about the oil spill that they, down in Ecuador. We're talking, they said it was 80 times larger than the oil spill in the Gulf of New Mexico. And for anybody who remembers the BP oil spill in the Gulf of New Mexico, that is an insane amount of waste that has been, presented in that area. And so when you hear things like that, it's like, okay, well, all excuses aside, how the hell did that happen? And how do you try and say, yeah, but, somehow there's some reason why, things are when people try and come back with this, yeah, but you got to understand, like,
yeah, but you got to understand shareholder value. Follow the money, Ben. Follow the money.
Yeah, I get shareholder value. I understand that. But as they say, there are things more important than money. And
absolutely. When you talk about being a good corporate citizen, and then this whole business about spin and deflection and lack of ownership, those are the opposite poles here. And so,
well, yeah, but Alan, like I teach business classes all the time. We talk about corporate strategy. We talk about being a corporate citizen. You can't stand there in a classroom full of students developing in their career, eager to start their career, talking about and teaching students about corporate social responsibility and ethical business practices and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And understandably, there's all sorts of discussion around that as well. But you can't stand in front of a group of people and stand behind your discipline. Right? Like this is what I have been trained and educated in, and try and talk positively about it. Meanwhile, you got shenanigans like this going on and people staying away from or trying to defend poor behavior. It's difficult. It's hard. And you hear cynical people talking about capitalism, and they talk about how greedy and terrible businesses are and all these horrible things that they do. But it makes what we're trying to discuss here difficult against the cynics, right? But business isn't all that. You're going to have bad players. You're going to have bad apples. You're going to have people who do terrible things. They should be called out for it. They should be held accountable for it. Changes should be made to correct it so that we don't continue down that path. And then we should put measures in place to prevent it from happening as we move forward. But we don't get rid of it. We don't kill it. I think there's more benefit than harm there is to it overall.
Absolutely.
And it's important to expose, to widen our eyes to these things and expose ourselves to this kind of information, because it helps us make better decisions as we move ahead.
Well, it's also tied, one of the enduring themes that runs through each of these podcasts is the business about leadership, ethical leadership, moral leadership, responsible leadership. And it's just as simple as you're talking there. I wrote down 3 things here. I messed up, I'm sorry, and I'll fix it. If a corporation just admits, because we all screw up and all businesses make mistakes too, it's to your point, just own up to it and then fix it.
Yeah, and this is actually a good segue into something else that we wanted to talk about too, which is, Alan, you speak some very plain sense there. Yes, you would hope that we lived in a world where you could say, I messed up, I'm sorry, I'm going to make it better. But typically what happens is, if we admit we messed up, then we're showing that we did not do a good job. And if we demonstrate that we didn't do a good job, then other people are going to judge us. And those people who judge us would rather have us out of the way than give us the opportunity to fix it and make it better, because they'll say, clearly you're not up to the job. Get the hell out. We'll get somebody else in here who can do it, because clearly you can't. And that's what, more times than not, is what ends up happening.
And what it does, it's just like the open door policy when some leader says, my door's always open. The first time you bring a problem to them, they yell and scream at you and throw you out of the office. Guess how many times you're going to come back?
Yeah, there are certainly cases of that as well, as I've had it explained to me. Yes, we do have an open door policy, but there's a path to that open door.
Well, there is, but I want to tie this back together to your point about standing behind your discipline and so forth. And I'm really not as naive as I might sound on the I messed up part. We went through the Army zero defects mentality some decades ago. And you don't know how much fun that is until you work for a boss that actually believes in that zero defects mentality. And because it's human to make mistakes, and in fact, it's important to growth and to to evolving and to learning things, to make mistakes. You've got to condone the mistakes. You got to support the mistakes, and you got to create the platforms and systems whereby, whether it's in the Army or in a business, it's okay to say, we made a mistake. And I'll give you one corporate example without naming the company, but there were some issues with deliveries of some munitions from this company. And when a person reported that they were having some issues, efforts were then made to, I'm going to say, conceal perhaps the issues that were there. And it ended up that a live munition got shipped out, and it wasn't stated that it was a live munition. Mistakes can happen. And so you need to create that environment, and good leaders do, to make it okay to screw up. But again, at a level's appropriate to your grade. You know, we used to say you don't want to have a captain making lieutenant mistakes or a major making captain mistakes. And so in your organization, if you allow your people to screw up, to come tell you about it, and then to fix it and to move on, you'll have a learning organization and hopefully prevent bigger errors from happening.
Having people feel that they work in an environment where it is safe to speak up and have that conversation. And I've worked in a lot of different environments with a lot of different types of leaders. And, you know, it's sad to say that I can count on one hand the number of people I've ever worked for where I really wanted to do the best job that I could because I wanted to impress the person I was working with. I always wanted to do well for them. Yeah. And that is not always found. And if you have that in your career, like, you know, do the best you can to hold on to it and preserve it, because it is difficult to get. And by the way, embrace it while you have it, because it doesn't always last long either. And so if you come across it, I mean, like you love it. And sometimes it's, I don't know, maybe 3 to 7 years that you get to work in an environment like that before it changes and evolves into something different. And I have to say, I mean, you know, knock on wood, I'm happy to be in a great environment with the work that I do. You know, this sounds hokey, but with all of the things that I'm doing, with all the people that I'm involved in, I'm working across great teams at every angle. I mean, it just really is. It's such a refreshing approach, but definitely love it while you got it, for sure.
Yeah. And contribute to making it sustainable as much as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and to that point, you know, something that we started talking about before we started recording today, and I think it's one of these things that is really important. You had brought it up, and that is talking about how people deal with stress and manage through stress. And I think you teed it up really well when in the last episode, we've talked about this a few times, time management. Time management is one of those things, and speaking from my own experience, I will just tell you, when I first started getting into project management, it was something that was new to me. Project management, especially dealing with multiple projects at the same time. There was a period of my life, lasted about 7 or 8 years, where during those 7 or 8 years, I was managing between 18 to 25 projects concurrently every day for 8 years. And I have to say I loved it. It was some of the best times that I ever had working. But I also remember a few things. One, my stress level was so high. Now, I loved it, keep in mind, but my stress level was so high. And high to the point where I was experiencing panic attacks.
Wow.
I was getting tightening of chest. I was waking up in the middle of the night. My eyes were so dilated, it was like daylight in the bedroom. I would be sitting at my desk and my heart would just start racing for no reason. And for a good like 2 years, just having these kind of on and off panic attack things. Now, keep in mind, I did say, and it's still true, I loved that period of time that I was working. It was great. There was a lot of activity, and I was working on a lot of really high profile projects for the company I was working on, like things, biggest projects for the biggest customers across the entire US, coast to coast, like just massively high visibility projects. But, of course, the side effect was panic attacks, stress, anxiety.
All those other good things, Ben, right?
all those other good things. But I've talked before about David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. And I've talked about finding that pursuit around positive psychology in the workplace and flourishing and all of that stuff. A lot of the reasons why my attention turned to those fields of study around positive psychology and time management, stress management, is because like I lived in a circumstance where I was like, I like being highly effective. I like having all of this stuff going on. I need to find better ways to cope with it.
So what did you learn? What did you learn from that 7 to 8 years? I cannot imagine 7 to 8 years under that kind of stress, inducing panic attacks. You're lucky you didn't have a heart attack, Ben.
Yeah. My wife says the same thing. At one point, I did go see a cardiologist because I was getting these just this high anxiety. Like I would be walking and then all of a sudden it was like being on a roller coaster. It was weird. It was a mix of both like adrenaline and thrill, but also panic.
Yeah. Fascinating. So what did you do? How did you deal with that?
Well, I did what I often do, which is I started diving into studying this phenomena. And I started thinking about like, okay, let me learn about meditation. What's interesting about this is I was raised Catholic. And so part of my upbringing is you look at these, well, I'll just call it these mystical things that are outside of your theology as, you're skeptical about them, like, oh, am I going into the dark side. And I didn't really know much about meditation. But what I've come to realize is that, prayer is meditation. Meditation is about getting focused on things, clearing the clutter out of your brain and finding something to focus on, whether that's something spiritual or something internal. But there's a lot of different ways to meditate, and people find ways to relax and meditate a lot of different ways. So learning about things like that, also eating habits, behavior, physical activity, all of these things started to surface as important stuff I needed to pay attention to. And then it was also putting things in order. Like, one of the reasons time management becomes this really, really important thing that we talk about is because how you manage your day means a lot to how much stress you carry. For example, if you don't write things down, if you don't have a list, if you constantly just try to remember stuff, and this is where the psychology came in, I started learning about what our brains are capable of doing. And what happens in the brain is that the brain is always trying to find shortcuts. It's always trying to find patterns and ways to develop heuristics that are going to lessen the amount of processing power that we put into something. Like similar to a computer, if you fire a bunch of information at a computer all day, like editing videos or crunching a bunch of numbers, that CPU is just running all the time. And what happens? Your computer gets hot. Over time, it fails. So what you try to do with your brain is you try and take all of these things that you're actively trying to remember, and you put them in a place that allows you to stop thinking about it, stop carrying it in the front of your lobe, and put it in a place where you can get to it as part of your workflow. So when you think about having a process and a methodology, we've talked about this before, processes and routines. When you develop good processes and routines for your workflow, then you can be assured that as something comes in, some new task, something you need to do, if you put it in the right place in your workflow and then forget about it and keep working on the things that you're working on, you'll come across it as part of the things that you're doing, right? So learning how to park stuff in the appropriate place, not trying to remember all of these things and have them rattling down in your head, creating lists, having to-do lists. Remember, I've spoken about in previous episodes how I always have this constant list that is running. It's just having all of these activities in a place where, I do my best to do a brain dump and then forget about it and move on so that I don't have to think about those things anymore. And that just reduces the amount of stress and tension and everything else. And then also just like not take everything so seriously.
Yeah, we've talked about humor. Humor is huge.
Yeah, and it's not about discounting or not taking things that need to be taken seriously as something serious that needs to happen, but we don't need to let it own and control us. And I've said this a couple times, we get to decide how much something is going to occupy our space. And if we allow the small things to be like what we obsess about, you got to make room for the things that need to be worried about, but also know that you can't tackle everything at once. So to the point of creating a list, you got something that needs to be thought about. Okay. Don't have the bandwidth for it right now. Fine. Write it down, put it in a place and schedule it to be thought about. Schedule a time for that thing to be thought about too. Yeah. Go ahead.
I love what you've been doing now with these podcasts of carving out little pieces and then making little short reels of them. And that quote that you just gave about deciding how much space we give to something needs to be one. And I need to make sure I got it down in my notes properly. Will you say it one more time, a little slower for my Texas handwriting?
Yeah. So we get to determine how much something takes up space and allows it to affect us. And it's tough. So right now, my father has recently been diagnosed with cancer. It's one of those things that, not fun to have to think about, not one of these things that we want to dwell on, but it's also one of those important things that we need to make room for. And so when you have all of these things going on in your life, right? You have work and you have your kids and you have commitments outside of your job, and maybe you've got a side hustle going on, and then life throws yet another curveball your way. And how do you make room for all of these things? And you have to be able, I think, to give the things attention when you can, and when, I don't want to say when it makes sense to, because that sounds a little insensitive. I think what I mean by this is I'm going to take time to spend with my family, and I'm going to block off other things for that to be a priority. Thankfully, I work with wonderful people who are like, go do what you need to do. But I also know that there's nothing I can do about the circumstance. I could let it take over my thinking and obsess about it day in and day out. That's not going to solve anything. There are people who are way smarter than me, who are more practiced in dealing with this than I am. And I have to let those people do their job, right? And then I take time to do mine. So when I talk about not allowing things you get to determine how much it's going to occupy your space. Doesn't mean that throughout my day it doesn't hit me. I don't think about it or anything like that. But it means that I have to be comfortable in how I'm processing it as I'm working.
You make the decision. You make that decision consciously about how much energy you're going to put into it.
Yeah. And
okay.
It's but it's funny because when you brought this topic up before we got into the taping today, I started thinking about every semester I'll have a student who reaches out and life has just thrown them a curveball. Mm-hmm. They've had a parent who's gotten sick, a parent who maybe passed away. They've gotten in a car accident. They've had an injury. They've gotten COVID, number of different things that happen. And life happens sometimes, oftentimes. And I have to realize they're still learning and they're still trying to figure out how to do this. But what I see a lot of times is a complete shutdown.
Yeah, right.
It's like this thing came up. I don't have the capacity to focus on anything else. I have to dedicate all of my time to this one thing. And the problem with that is that life never stops. Work never stops. There's a phrase. I'm going to tell you the way that I heard it, but I also, in doing some research around it, I can't say that this is exactly how it went down. But the way I heard it was when Charles de Gaulle took over as the Prime Minister of France, he wanted to clean house, and his advisors said, sir, these people, you can't get rid of them. They're indispensable. And as the story goes, his remark was, the fields of France are filled with indispensable people. And the meaning of that is people are going to have their time. They're going to move on. They're going to be gone. Nobody's indispensable. Everybody gets replaced. Disney's a 100-year-old company. The man who founded the company and whose namesake it is has been gone for some time. They're bigger today than they've ever been. Same with Coca-Cola, same with IBM, same with Apple. Someone as recently as Steve Jobs. Apple's a bigger company today than they were when Steve Jobs passed. So, people leave a legacy, certainly. But as far as being indispensable, it's a way of really recalibrating how you think what you think your value is to something, that people will find a way to continue on. And I'm one of these people. I always try to bring it back into just snap it back into reality. And, it's funny because we'll take Steve Jobs, for example. Everybody knows Steve Jobs. Some people even know where Steve Jobs used to live up in the, I think Santa Cruz Mountains there, not too far away from Silicon Valley. Nobody knows who Steve Jobs' neighbor was. The point there is that we all do important stuff, and we're all valuable to the people who we touch the closest. But at the end of the day, the world is gonna go on. Don't be so caught up in the fact that you have to be in the center of it all. It doesn't always require you to be there 100% of the time. So, you gotta find those moments for you to unplug and pull away. And we're all doing stuff we're proud of. We're all doing stuff we want to work towards, building something bigger and greater and all that other stuff. But yeah, talk about stress management. I think at that time when I was doing all of those big, important projects and working with all of these big, important companies, it felt great, I think primarily because I had never really worked at that level before, and it was just energizing. But then after a while, you realize it's oh, well, no one remembers that ad campaign. Nobody remembers that. I could talk about, I've worked with businesses that are no longer in business anymore or have been acquired or have been sold several times over and are nothing like what they used to be. So yeah, it's all important in the moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be your legacy.
I want to pull on this thread here because it's one that I've dealt with in my own life, dealing with a lot of stress over the years, both in the military and in the corporate world. You talked about those closest to you. In that 8-year period, how did the stress manifest itself in your relationships with people you cared about? How did you work that over the years, and what have you learned about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think when I get stressed, my blinders come up, right? So all I see is like what's right in front of me. What's happening to the left or to the right of me, I don't really invest a lot of time in. So for example, my wife, she would, want to plan vacation, right? So when kids are in school, you have these cycles, and we had homeschooled both of our kids. That was kind of the nice part of doing that, is that we didn't have to travel during the cycles everybody else did, but we'd still be trying to plan family vacations. And, my response more times than not was just tell me what I need to block off in my calendar. You do the rest, and I'll show up when it's time. And, was that fair? Was that the way it should have been done? Probably not. But she always did good that way. But that's, I had this tendency to just only focus on the immediate things that were right in front of me. And part of this, that's also part of like not allowing yourself to get preoccupied with things that are going to be a distraction. Park them somewhere so that you don't have to think about it. The unfortunate side effect of that is you lose visibility of certain things. And case in point, this is crazy. When I was a manager, managing a team of people, managing all these high profile projects. On the flip side, academically, I had also been promoted into a leadership role where I was managing 20 faculty and 8 different classes that were part of the college. And I was literally a manager in 2 different industries at the same time. And for a period of 2 years, I don't recall spending much time with my kids. And that was, it's time you'll never get back.
Yes.
But it's also, it also as a family allowed us to do things that were different as well. And I talk about this a lot with people who are interested in executive leadership. Here's something that you have to understand is that when you work yourself to the highest levels of an organization, especially if it's a global organization, there are no vacation days. There's time off you think you might get, but you're always halfway in whatever you're doing. And you think about, let's think about, for example, let's think about Tim Cook. Mm-hmm. Tim Cook is CEO of Apple, multi-billion-dollar global organization that makes more money than many countries around the world. He's overseeing a global workforce. It could be its own country, and Tim Cook is like the president or prime minister of a country. It's a job that never stops. If there's a fire in a factory in China, you're going to know about it. If there's a high-profile sexual harassment lawsuit that is brewing, you're going to know about it. If one of your stores catches fire or a display falls and kills somebody, you're on. You can't not be on. If you're Bob Iger, and what happened unfortunately at Disney when an alligator kills a guest, a guest child. I mean, you're accountable for everything that happens in those companies. And so high level executive leaders don't really turn it off. They don't, there's no like, hey, I'm untouchable. I can't be reached. I'm out of the office. I clocked out. It's 5 o'clock. I'm going home. There's none of that. That doesn't exist for anybody who's in senior level management for any company, or if you're an entrepreneur. It just doesn't exist. Right. And I've had these conversations with a lot of people, and they say, you know, like, I tell people, like, when I go on vacation, I take my laptop with me. I'm always on my phone. And I do that because for me, that's how I don't stress, is by being aware, being constantly a little bit plugged into everything. That helps me. There's a lot of people who are like, I can't do that. I won't do that. I won't sacrifice time with my kids. I won't sacrifice time at home. I won't, you know, fine. Nobody's telling you you have to. But at the same time, you can't sit there and get mad at these people who, because they're always on and always working, always doing these things, and they've amassed all of this experience and all the other things that come along with it, you can't sit there and be like, hey, that's not fair. Believe me, they've made trade-offs, trade-offs that some other people just aren't willing to make. And that's kind of why they have some of those things that others may not. Alan, I got to ask you, because I got diarrhea of the mouth this afternoon. You commanded a large number of people. As a colonel, how many people were under your command?
Oh, my battalion level command from 93 to 95, I was a lieutenant colonel, and I commanded 243 Patriot Battalion for 18th Airborne Corps, and it was between 600 and 700 soldiers and their family members that I was responsible for 2 years.
I love the fact that you always say "and their family members," because I will say this, in corporate America, you never hear people talk about that.
Yeah.
They always just say my employees, but you really are in charge of their families as well.
You really are. And especially if you're deploying them, which we ended up doing 2 weeks after I took command. We were gone for 7 months, left my wife behind in a brand new location that she wasn't accustomed to, and she had to lead the spouses group. It's the best deal the government's got, because the spouses get paid nothing for their effort and work in keeping those families together while their significant others are deployed.
I feel a little selfish here because I'm talking about like corporate work, but you're doing the work that keeps this country safe. And how is it for you when you've got 600-700 people and their families that you're responsible for, as along with your own family, and you know your heart is always heaviest near your home base, and your kids, you know, I've got kids, you've got kids, they've all been teenagers, they've all had to rise up to levels at times when you can't be there, and you're halfway around the globe. And it's not like every evening when you go back to the Courtyard Marriott and you're putting your feet up on the bed and you're calling home, like, you know, there's none of that. Like you're literally out in the middle of nowhere.
Literally in the middle of nowhere.
It could be days. I'm going to just say, correct me if I'm wrong, it could be weeks in between one call to the next back home. How do you stay focused? How do you not let all of this just chew you up? Especially, and look, I'm just going to be real about this. Anybody who's been in a long-term relationship, I wish I could tell you every single day is rosy and it's all, you know, fun and sunshine. But, you know, sometimes you don't leave things well, but you still got to go. And so I don't know. Do you ever have a moment where things like, it's like, oh, you know, we didn't leave it well, but I got to go. And now it's 3 weeks later and I finally get to have another phone call. Or did you have a rule that was like, we never leave unless things are good? Like, how do you do that?
Everything you can imagine, everything that you are imagining has happened. And and one of the reasons why, and we talked a little bit about this last time, when I say I am a lifelong student of leadership, I don't consider myself an expert, and I run away from people who claim to be experts in leadership because that means they quit learning. So I'm interested in this whole business of stress management because it's important and impactful in my mentor business, as well as even in my life today, that generates a different level of stress for a number of things. And so a lot of it is you live and you learn. I mentioned to you last time that in my command, it was life and death in a lot of cases. And the circumstances were I created some collateral damage that I'm not terribly proud of, ruining some kids' lives because I felt like I needed to do that to bring them all back alive. You learn a lot of tolerance. You learn a lot of patience, which is not one of my virtues. You learn, I'm going to use the word rationalization because I think whether you're in the corporate world or military, you rationalize the time you're not able to spend with your family by saying that what you're doing is for national defense or what you're doing is for the greater good of the world or the Army or for their families. And you could say the same thing in the defense industry where I was, where those senior leaders don't get to spend a lot of time there. What I learned is that over time, it's back to where you said there's trade-offs. Kids spell love time, Time. That's how they spell love. And I can still go back and remember times where our kids were teenagers. I was home. I wasn't deploying. And I would get in an argument with one of my kids or get in an argument with my wife or whatever. And we're human, and you learn commitment. My wife is the most committed person in this world. 49 years she stood by my side. She didn't even want me to be in the Army. And yet she was a magnificent Army spouse's, senior Army leader's wife. The other thing is you're surrounded by people that are just like you. You're all suffering together. You're all raising kids together. You're all trying to make ends meet. You all just want to get home safely. And that's when you hear that camaraderie that the Army talks about. So you're never suffering alone, which is, I think, a bit different than I saw and experienced in the corporate world. It's just like you were saying about they don't ever talk about the families, even though the families are involved. So you live and you learn, you be committed, you focus on what's most important, you change the things that you can change, you pray a lot, you learn forgiveness a lot. And I'm going to brag on my kids and my wife. And she's a kinder teacher right now. She gets the greatest joy out of teaching those kids. And she's given all these decades, and she's still out there giving. Yesterday, we have 4 children, and are very proud of all of them. They lived this military life. Emily is a PhD in sociology. She's a professor at Washington Lee University's business school. And she studied sustainable capitalism in Cuba and compared it to B Corps in the United States, which is why this greenwashing is very significant to me. Her sister, Sarah, just received her master's degree from HEC Paris in innovation and entrepreneurship. Britton, our oldest son, is an Army Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, combat diver, Bronze Star recipient, commanded an A-team in Afghanistan for 42 months. And he's now director at a Department of Defense organization at Kirtland Air Force Base. John just took over command of the Army's only public affairs battalion at Fort Bliss, Texas. And just yesterday, he sent me his officer efficiency report, where he was rated number 1 of 23 field grade officers in very competitive positions. In spite of all the things I did wrong as a dad, in spite of all the time that I wasn't there to be with them, in spite of all the times I was an asshole to them, to be honest with you, or impatient because I was stressed or whatever, they turned out pretty damn good, Ben.
I think what is hard, what has always been hard for me to see in corporate America is when I see people get so committed to the work and their families are falling apart around them, and there's like, I got to focus on this. I got to get this work done. And like you, Alan, now I feel so, Alan, come on. We're schlepping caramel colored sugared soda water. Like it's nothing like defending the nation. But, at the end of the day, it was the work that I did, and it was the work that I was happy to do. But I think if you don't have that home base, that balance, it does make things a lot more difficult. That is a tremendous amount to be proud of. And I think that's probably, for me, go back to all the time we talk about, like, why am I doing this? Why am I starting a company that makes no money? I'm doing a lot. I'm doing this. A lot of the reason is because I need an outlet to put this information out there so that people don't have to work as hard as I did to figure out how to, get to where we are. And I love working with people like you and the other people on the board, the people I've been talking to lately about this, because we all have that in us. It's almost like we wish we had somebody to mentor us. And so now we're going to take it upon ourselves to help mentor other people, to bring them along a little bit faster and say, look, this is what I did. And be honest with you, I made it through, but I'm not going to say it was the best way to do it. It's kind of this passion of wanting to just share what you know, and hopefully it spreads and more people latch onto it. And I'm big about the fact that, if we collaborate, we're all having the conversation, we're all figuring it out together. It's so much like collaboration is so much more beneficial than competition. It just is.
It's very interesting that you said that, because you're exactly right. And it might sound strange, but we're peas in a pod. The reason I am doing this, the reason I'm investing my time and energy, is for the same reason you are, to share these insights and lessons learned. And as we co-mentor each other, and that's what we're doing as we co-mentor each other, and you create these magnificent platforms to share with other people. And so I'm gonna go back to one of our first conversations. I said the two things I ask people is, how do you define wealth, and what legacy do you want to leave behind when you go? And we talk about these enduring lessons that we're creating out there. We're searchers, and we're both searching for our enduring legacy. What is it we're trying to leave behind to make it better for those that follow us? And I think that's a noble purpose, and certainly one I'm proud to contribute to. So,
and it's so funny because the more people that I'm starting to talk to about this and what we're doing, what we're building, they get excited about it. And it's kind of like, they're almost like, now we've got this place and we've got an in to start talking about all of these things that we're doing. And I just like the way that we're kind of set up to have this kind of reciprocal thing where, you contribute to us and we're going to contribute back to you by spreading the gospel of what you're doing and sharing that with other people. And it would be great that this becomes a marketplace for people with all different kinds of skill sets, and you can tap into people and their knowledge. And it's funny. One of the people that I spoke with recently, a gentleman by the name of Sam Doshi, I decided I was going to donate some of my time to a project that Sam is working on, where you can make yourself available for people who want to pick your brain about something that they need help with. And there's no business model around this. He's literally just setting this up as something for people in his network to be able to access. And it gets me to thinking, like, the Daily Pitch can be, or really Disc Media as a company, can be a little bit of that. Can be like, hey, you read an article. here's a bio on the author. Feel free to reach out to them if you want to know more about,
Yes.
X, Y, and Z. Like, don't feel like you can't connect with the people who you read about and the things that we're doing. And hell, if you can't figure out how to get a hold of them, reach out to me and I'll connect you with them. I think that it just works so much better when you have a way to get access to people to ask them questions and help you figure things out.
I just stumbled to something I had not thought of before, but one of the other reasons I'm so attracted to the work that you're doing, when I created Growing Mentor Intelligence, it was to take mentoring and make it available across the span of people, whether they had a sponsor in corporate world or not. I wanted to make mentoring egalitarian, where everyone earned it, everyone deserves it, everyone could have it, everyone could have access to it. You're doing the same thing with business education. That's exactly what you're trying to do, is make it widely available to everybody.
Yeah. And present it in a way that isn't stuffy and, uses a lot of big 10-cent words. And Alan, I really do that more for my benefit than anybody else's.
Are you ready for a recap here?
Yeah, let's hear the rundown of what did we learn today?
Insights. Today's top 10. Ben's top 10 insights. I started this conversation about the success that you have been making with good conversations. And I think what the business piece here that's so important for someone beginning is outreach is critical to expanding your audience and getting your content broadened. And it becomes progressive. And so you build on that success. So if you're out there building a business, go out there and follow what Ben's doing, do the research, then stay busy, stay involved, and continue to grow. The second one came about in that conversation about understanding the full story before you judge, even in these controversial subjects where the sound bites now seem to have more portent than the substance behind them. And I recall that this used to be part of being an educated human being, that you informed your judgment before you had a judgment. And now we've done just the opposite. So do the work and understand the full story. The third key insight is a piece of wisdom about being a good corporate citizen. I don't care how ambitious you are. I don't care what your background is. You have an obligation. You got a privilege of being in a corporation. Take care of your people and act responsibly. And the opposite of that is spin, deflection, and lack of ownership. No yeah buts. Simply own it. Own it as it is. The fourth insight is in this business as a professor that you have. I loved your words there. It's a great soundbite. Stand behind your discipline. Don't defend poor behavior. Right now, we have so many instances across our social media of poor behavior that is being sustained when it shouldn't be, which led to this conversation of, I messed up, I'm sorry, I'll fix it, just fix it. Leaders create that environment, and that is the piece that I think is what allows you to stand behind your discipline, is if you have leaders that you respect. The fifth one, your comment that it's really rare to find the great teams. That's a really true statement. And all the teams I've been in, some good teams, some fantastic teams, they eventually dissolve for one reason or the other. And I certainly didn't always appreciate it while it was there. I sure appreciated it a lot when I left it and fell into a team that wasn't as good. So, do your best as a corporate leader to create that kind of a team while you're in there. And then if you get into one that's not as good, try to create them the same way. The next section was a big one about dealing with stress and managing through all the challenges that are out there. And to your point, there's no easy answers here. It's about trade-offs. But you talked about your own coping mechanisms. You started diving into study because that's how you do it. You did meditation. You looked carefully at your eating habits. You looked at your physical behaviors and all those kinds of things. But you also grew. And as you grew and you learned, you were able to manage and create tools that you're using today because your workload's only increased. It hasn't decreased. I mean, I'm blown away. You tire me out just watching all the things you post every day. So that's a big one. Number 7 was putting things in order about how you spend your day, having processes and I can't read that word, processes and something for workflow.
Routines, probably.
It's routines. That word is routines. That's a really good way to help people manage the overwhelming sense that they might have. And God knows, once you learn and create those routines, you don't know how much more you can handle. And so that's a really, really big one. And tied to that one, also managing stress is not taking yourself so seriously. We talk about humor all the time. It is okay to laugh. There's a lot of things that are funny in the world. And if you stop laughing, your sense of humor, guess what? You know, they say that a smile can light up the world, and it really can. It affects every relationship that you do have there. Okay, number 8. I love this quote, and this has got to be one of your sound bites. We get to decide how much space something takes up and how much we allow it to affect us. And talking about how we let all these work-life things get out of snap, out of balance, and, you know, would drive some people to a complete shutdown. You said it, life never stops, work never stops. You know, you just got to keep working through all of that. And giving, you've talked about this with time management, giving, you focus very clearly on the priorities, and that's what you give the attention to. You block off the others, and you get to them when you get to them. And there's some wisdom in that. We had an interesting conversation. Number 9 is about relationships. And you talked about how blinders come up. Well, they did the same for me. Your conversation around senior executive leadership is spot on. I mentioned, I think last time, that this conference I was at in Chicago, the guest speaker, Nellie Galen, spoke. She's written a lot of books, and she spoke about knowing 7 billionaires personally, and every one of them was unhappy with the status of their life. That's because they define wealth and legacy differently. Children spell love, time. And so when you start thinking about what you want your life to look like 20, 30, 40 years from now, it puts a different spin perhaps on it than things now. So there's always going to be trade-offs and collateral damage. The final note is just on the thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about in my life now is, what do I want my legacy to be after I'm gone? And one of the reasons I love the work you're doing is you can take, nobody remembers the positions I did. Nobody remembers the command that you had. Nobody remembers what house you lived in, or if you were the neighbor to Steve Jobs or whatever. But when you live on in the lives of others and you create a legacy, or you write a book, or you have podcasts where your story's out there and you've laid out the best of your life to others, that's a step toward creating an enduring legacy. And that, my friend, defines wealth that I'm proud to share with you. So thank you.
A couple follow-ups there. First of all, you had mentioned all of these things that I'm always posting. I want folks to know that there are specific times that we talked about it. There are specific times that I block off to put all of these things in a pipeline, so that while it does appear that I'm always working, a lot of those things have been planned out. So I've got a media calendar that is scheduled at least 2 weeks out from the taping of this. So most of my content is already preloaded and scheduled because it's something that I work on when I'm not doing my other stuff. So if you see me posting in the middle of the day, it's the machine that's posting for me. So that helps.
Processes and routines.
That's it, man. You gotta have that done. It makes you more efficient. And then the other thing, when you talk about laughing, I will just say this: make sure you know the appropriate times to laugh, because I have not always known that, and it has gotten me in trouble on more than one occasion. Well, hey, Alan, thank you so much. This has been a very good therapy session. But thanks much, everybody, for checking this episode, and we will be back again next week with some more enduring content, as Alan likes to say. So until then, everybody, adios.
Adios. See you next week.